Similarly, a large third Rome component in the new Russian military doctrine. Well, what can be done? Right now, the main institution that can keep Russia together and avoid chaos is clearly the military forces. The Russian army is the most essential pillar of power left in the country. The problem is that military rule by itself only leads further into a breakdown crisis. In order to overcome the crisis, the military component must be supplemented by the scientific and technological contributions of the intelligentsia. And once again, we see that the intelligentsia as a Russian national institution is one of the keys to this entire problem. Now, we were often asked, talking to people, what's your alternative to Jeffrey Sachs, the IMF, and the shock therapy? Let me give you a number of points that I think Executive Intelligence Review would recommend as an alternative Russian economic policy that would work as an anti-crisis measure. Everything I say now needs to be taken in the context of the LaRouche program for the European Productive Triangle, which was offered in late 1989 and early 1990, which has been, as I'll try to show you, widely discussed in Moscow. What should Russia actually be doing? Or if you were a Russian patriot today campaigning in the elections, what might a recovery program look like? Firstly, Russia must terminate the insanity of International Monetary Fund conditionalities. Indeed, Russia would be well advised to have nothing further to do with this institution. It goes without saying that such aspects of the IMF policy as shock therapy, Jeffrey Sachs, George Soros, and so forth, all of this must simply be thrown out the window. To replace the IMF line, Russia would require a dirigistic and protectionist approach to economics as nation building. Here, the necessary institution is a national bank. Notice I say national bank and not a central bank on the Federal Reserve model. Russia would need a national bank of the type created by Alexander Hamilton as the first Bank of the United States, or Henry Clay's second Bank of the United States. For people who've never heard of these two institutions, you can go to Philadelphia today and find both of them still standing not far from Independence Hall. The purpose of a national bank is to issue credit for production in agriculture and industry. For those borrowers who can meet the requirements, long-term, low-interest loans are offered in order to stimulate activities which we know contribute to real national wealth. Privatization must be subordinated to the need to maintain and expand the necessary levels of production in a world economic depression and Russian national emergency. Now, state planning of the Stalinist variety, the old GOS plan, this old planning that planned everything down to the last nut and bolt, was of course an absurd and unworkable system. But indicative planning, that is to say, the creation of a list of great national priorities, that is indispensable. This was de Gaulle's approach in France in the late 50s and early 60s. It is the best of the tradition of the Japanese MITI. If you're interested in Taiwan, the reason that Taiwan has survived was because President Chiang Ching-kuo set up a list of national projects in the late 70s and early 80s, and we can go down the line with other successful examples. Russia would need a priority list of great national undertakings, such as we would suggest the building of a new Trans-Siberian Railway using the most modern magnetic levitation technologies. This would permit the colossal energy of the Russian people to be expressed in great projects that would be of benefit for Russia as well as for the rest of humanity. National planning must also identify targets of food production, housing, clothing, and other needs, and it must set forth methods to meet these needs in the context of attaining full employment as soon as possible. Now, Russia right now suffers, as we do here in the U.S., from an immense deficit in modern infrastructure. The rail and highway systems of Russia are totally obsolete after decades of Cold War depletion. Even more alarming is the status of the electricity grid, and I think this is now the big issue as we go into the winter. The Russian electricity grid appears to me to be in a process of collapse, which is spreading out of Russia into Ukraine, into Hungary, and perhaps into the rest of Eastern Europe. What you therefore need would be state-sponsored credit, first and foremost to finance the building of modern magnetic levitation railways, superhighways, canals, water systems, telecommunications, and electronuclear energy grids. In the area of soft infrastructure, it's clear that large numbers of schools and hospitals need to be built. Now, for most of these projects, the main borrower would be a government agency at the local or regional level. But many of the subcontractors who actually carry out the work will be private firms. A large-scale infrastructure program is the absolutely necessary ingredient to reverse economic decline, to create demand for steel, concrete, and other basic commodities, and to create millions of new productive jobs. And in order to improve the supply situation, one aspect of infrastructure that needs great emphasis is food distribution and delivery, so as to prevent so much food from being lost to spoilage. Now, a special problem for Russia, and indeed for all countries emerging from communism, is the absence of a fabric of productive, small and medium industrial and technological firms. Now, note the emphasis on productive. We are talking again about the creation of tangible physical products, not services, financial services, gambling, public relations, advertising, drug money laundering, or any of this. We are talking about what the Germans call Mittelständische Betriebe. The classical high-technology small firm is one where the president of the company is himself or herself a scientist or investor, and where the operation has the flexibility which a mastodontic corporate or government bureaucracy can never have. Such firms are the places where new scientific discoveries are originated and turned into machine tools that can find their place in the assembly lines of larger factories. So the national bank would therefore have to open a special, low-interest, long-term credit facility specifically for the needs of new, small, and medium productive ventures. Now you have the problem of mafia criminality. A tax code for Russia would have to reflect a bias in favor of production and against all kinds of parasitical and speculative activities. Income deriving from financial speculation or other forms of gambling ought to be taxed at a higher rate than income deriving from commodity production. In a similar way, tax credits can be instituted so that money which is productively invested in new technology, plant, and equipment can reduce the total tax paid. Tax credits can also be used to foster savings. Now, because of the vast expansion of organized crime, a currency reform is probably unavoidable. A good model is de Gaulle's introduction of the French heavy franc during the late 1950s in cooperation with Jacques Roueff. In the course of a currency reform, what happens, of course, is that all persons are required to account for currency in their possession in excess of their recent tax returns. So what happens in practice is that organized crime cash reserves are either confiscated or wiped out. These last 2 points on the tax code and the currency reform are discussed in one of LaRouche's essays, I believe from 1981, entitled A Gaullist Solution to the Italian Monetary Crisis. And I think what you get out of this is that a heavy ruble may turn out to be one of the most effective and humane ways of putting gangsters out of business. It's far more humane than other means that one can imagine in which speculators and parasites and so forth have been dealt with in Russian history. Now, Russian agriculture. Russian farms cannot keep producing for long if the prices paid to farmers are inferior to their cost of production. So the government must therefore establish parity prices for the main farm commodities. Parity prices would reflect the relevant cost of production plus a reasonable profit margin that must be sufficient to permit new investments and technological modernization. A good model here would be U.S. agricultural policy during World War II, when high levels of food production were obviously desirable for defense purposes, and these were obtained by paying farmers 100% of parity or even 110% of parity in certain cases. Now, to defend parity prices and to protect Russian farmers and manufacturers against economic warfare, dumping, and so forth from abroad, a full array of protective tariffs would be required. Protective tariffs would have to be put in place to defend every productive sector where Russia seeks to produce, to cultivate. Other important tools of economic self-defense would include capital controls and exchange controls. That would help to protect the ruble against speculative attacks of the types associated with George Soros and his friends at the New York Fed and the Bank of England. Economic self-defense is all the more important for Russia because of the looming panic crash of the derivative securities markets in the Western world. Now, because of the domination of the international markets by Anglo-American financial cartels, Russia would need to secure her own needs in international trade through a series of bilateral contracts for the delivery of goods. These contracts should establish mutually acceptable prices, not necessarily the London or New York price, but mutually acceptable prices. Examples might include a Russo-Ukrainian contract to exchange Russian oil or energy for Ukrainian grain without passing through the dollar or pound-based staple markets in London, New York, or Chicago. As you will see, one of the assumptions we make is that independent Russia and independent Ukraine need each other as sovereign allies against the International Monetary Fund, which is the greater enemy of both. Finally, the division of labor in the old Comecon had evolved over decades, and it was a tragic mistake to simply junk all of these economic relationships because of the post-1989 political changes. Many people have suffered as a result of this. Today, Germany, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovakia, Poland, and others might now be interested in restoring certain kinds of commodity flows on the basis of the bilateral contracts just described. These countries would get a chance to reduce unemployment and keep their factories functioning. One priority area for Russia would be oil drilling and pumping equipment to reverse the fall in oil production. You can also think of the need to import transportation equipment from Hungary and so forth. Now, what I put together here was approximately 12 points, and what I've just described would represent the essential elements of an economic recovery program for Russia, or indeed for any other nation. The method employed here is the classically Hamiltonian American system economics in the modern synthesis of Lyndon LaRouche. And we subsume here, among other things, the lessons of the post-1939 U.S. recovery that actually put an end to the Great Depression. I would submit that this kind of economic program would work without question and would be to the great benefit of Russia. It is a program that would be immediately understood by a person such as Count Sergei Witte or economists from the Russian school like Podolinsky. And I would certainly submit that economic development along these lines is a much better bet than the apocalyptic quest for the third Rome.